Great. Hi, everybody. For those who don't know me, I'm Rick Muir. I'm Director of the Police Foundation. Welcome to our regular Friday exchange, which we do once a month, which is a conversation with somebody who's got interesting things to say about policing. And I'm really delighted that today we're joined by Sir Craig Mackey, who was formerly Deputy Commissioner at the Metropolitan Police. Prior to that was Chief Constable in Cumbria, and has also been a chief officer in Wiltshire and Gloucestershire. Has done a number of things since he left policing, including a major review of serious and organised crime for the Home Secretary, and we're going to try and talk about different themes and aspects of these different parts of Craig's career as we go through the discussion. Just a few points before we start, which is if you want to put a question to Craig, then you can do it by the chat function. So just put a question in the chat function and I'll then pick out questions to ask. Apologies in advance if we don't get to all of the questions. It's just sometimes we just don't have the time. We've just got an hour and we will close exactly on 2 o'clock. Also, just to note that we are recording the session and we do post it on our YouTube channel afterwards. So please bear that in mind when you're making any comments and so on. Brilliant. Well, look, thanks very much for doing this, Craig. I just wonder if we could start with a bit of your biography, and if you could, I guess maybe we come at it from both ends. So what is it that, how did you end up joining the police, and how did you end up being Deputy Commissioner at the Met, and what was the bit in between those two things? So if you could just give us a little tour of your trajectory in policing, that would be great.
Thanks, Rick, and thank you. Firstly, thank you for the opportunity to do this. I suppose I'm still wrestling with answering that question. How did I end up as the Deputy Commissioner of the Met? No, so I grew up a perfectly normal existence like everyone else. I grew up in rural Shropshire. We went to school. If I did one rebelling thing in life, it's probably when I was in the sixth form at school, when all of my friends and compatriots were looking at UCAS applications and deciding which university to go to. I wanted to do something quite different, and I joined the Merchant Navy and went to sea. I joined BP tankers and went off around the world. And I always remember, we finished our A-levels, I think in those years, it used to be back in about May, and by June I was off at sea. Which, as you can imagine, for someone growing up with no background in that area and certainly no family connections with it, people looked at me sort of aghast and askance at why on earth would he do this? But I'd sort of got this, I suppose, wanderlust and a desire to do something a little bit different. I joined BP. I worked with them for over 4 years. It's a strange life going to sea. You get 2 weeks when you first join the organisation to make sure you don't kill yourself or anyone else around you, and then send you off to sea for 4 to 6 months. And like many people in that era, I qualified in the sort of early 1980s as a deck officer, called into BP with a number of others, and great, you've all done really, really well, fantastic. You're all made redundant. And we went, oh, right. And they were going through quite a change in terms of where they were. So in the sort of early 1980s, I was one of those people who sort of thought, well, do I stay at sea or do I do something different? Now, I'd thought about policing. I thought about policing when I was about 17 and a half, but I was a very immature 17 and a half year old. You wouldn't have wanted someone like me in and around something as important as policing. So by now I was 22 and thought, okay, let's do something different. And for those who didn't work in the early 1980s, it was a very different job market. It was the era of sort of, for those who ever saw Boys from the Black Stuff, gets a job. There was a recession on, and even in policing, there were huge lists. And the advice was apply to a lot of police forces. And, if you really want to join, you're going to have to wait an awful long time. So I applied. And Wiltshire came up, and I joined Wiltshire and joined as a normal entrant. Went to regional training school, into policing, and I'd done about 4 or 5 years. And as you do, I've been very lucky through my career to have people who just sort of either take an interest or inspire me to take an interest. And a superintendent, a chief inspector called me in the office, which was always going to be a worry in those sort of days. And I always remember called me in, and actually the superintendent had been in the merchant. He said, "Why haven't you done your sergeant's exam?" I'm sorry, get on and do this. And I did, ended up on the special course, as it was in those days, accelerated promotion course, and then went through a period of training. I stayed in Wiltshire all the way through to sort of 2000, 2001 when I did the command course, went to Gloucestershire as deputy, and luckily enough in 2007 selected as chief in Cumbria, then on to the Met in 2012. And I sort of rolled out of policing in sort of this time 6 years ago. So consider myself incredibly lucky, incredibly fortunate. Some of those early experiences with BP and being at sea, I still use those experiences in life now. And I tend to be one of those people who treat sort of every day as a bit of a school day. The 6 years post-retirement, I've probably learned as much as I did in the last 6 years of policing. That's the reality. I get quite excited by someone who says, "Oh, here's a new task or challenge, have a go at it."
Yeah, brilliant. No, well, a really varied career, and I had no idea you were in the Merchant Navy. So there we are. That's super interesting.
Yeah, there
And
are
it's
some transferable skills to reassure you.
right.
I've never had to use Morse by flashing light in policing or take a position, but certainly some of them are, and it's not uncommon. You find quite a few people
Right.
who were at sea who are in policing. I think it's something to do with working with people and dealing with people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and of course, it gave you some experience working in the private sector as well, which I know
Yeah.
we're going to come on and talk a bit um, about some of those issues later on. But I think I just thought a good way of starting this would be to thinking about your work on serious and organised crime, which and this is something that a major review which you did for the then Home Secretary um, on the kind of the whole way in which our kind of SOC infrastructure is set up in this country, and I know for various reasons the report itself wasn't published in the end. But there was a huge, I know from talking to you in the past and from looking at the sort of summaries of what you did, that there was a huge amount of work went into that, and a lot of really interesting ideas. So I just wonder what if you could tell it. It's probably too big a question to answer all at once, but what was the big thing that you found in terms of the way in which our serious organised crime system is set up?
So no, thank you. I mean, there were a number of things in terms of the approach. And first of all, I should say it's done very much. I've been fortunate enough post-retirement to do 3 or 4 major reviews. I reviewed action fraud, did some work on forensics for National Police Chiefs Council, and they're always team efforts. So I've been really lucky to have some great people in the team with me, and particularly on SOC, I had people from right across government and most of the SOC sector. So getting a view from the Treasury officials on there, how they saw the SOC system, getting a view from the security services, how they saw it, gives you a much richer picture. And we started with a sort of working through and looking at a sort of a list of assumptions around where SOC was and then where it needed to go. But in terms of sort of the big ideas, the debates we had very much were around, how do you want this system to work? And I'm sort of quite a visual thinker, so I talk about dials and knobs, and it's to try and encourage people to engage in the debate, because it was pretty clear when we went round, you had lots of people who thought this was much more of a system than it intuitively is. And you had people who thought that the Home Secretary was effectively a controlling mind that could just say turn right, and this huge beast would turn right. That's not the reality. So you had to decide, where do you want to be on that sort of dial, from a very local controlled system, which I would argue we have at the moment, has real strengths, but it does have some weaknesses, to a very central control. And probably the thing I would always do when I was working with people and trying to get people to say where they sit on that, is sort of say, you probably don't want to be at either of the two extremes. You probably want to be somewhere in the middle, but you then need to explore with people, what does that mean? So how much control do I give up? What do I do about funding, etc., etc.? And then we use the lens of capacity and capability. This is a highly capacity constrained system. And by that, I mean, it's short of money and it's short of people in particular. And that's a range of skills, not just what I would call traditional police officer skills. And capabilities are being developed in quite an ad hoc way. And the sort of reviews like I did don't come out of sort of thin air. You'd already had a 2018 SOC strategy that talked about the size and the threat of it. I was also asked to look across, wider than sort of law enforcement and policing, and could you see, in my language, could you see the fingerprints of SOC across government? And you couldn't. For something that was such a high threat, it was right up there on the National Security Register. If you went to another government department, they'd sort of, if you were lucky, they'd have someone who knew something about it. If you weren't, they'd sort of say it's something to do with the Home Office. And that just didn't seem like a sustainable model going forward. So we talked about what you needed to do to try and address some of those things. So it was really about looking at it at that sort of system level, talking about what you need to do to address it and why it worked. But also with some of the stakeholders, it was also trying to explain why what you've got at the moment is not delivering perhaps what you thought it was. And some of that goes to some of the sort of assumptions we started to test. And we looked at assumptions quite early on and said, look, if you're going to do a review like this, you've got to have some sort of basic assumptions, a bit like you would with a program or project. And we said, you've reached the limit of what you can do around voluntary arrangements. For those who don't work in the sector all the time, a lot of the law enforcement sort of arrangements were entirely voluntary. They're covered by something called Section 22A agreements, where you and I, Rick, agree to be nice with each other and we provide a service. And when we move on, it might stay, it might not. We can't keep doing it like that. You also needed some funding reform. It was quite a shock. And in fairness to everybody involved, this has got better. But if you looked at the NCA in those days, about £1 in every 3 was what I would call time limited funding. And we spent an awful lot of time going to both ministers and to the Treasury and saying, look, you're buying a service, you're giving 12 months of money for it, and you're getting sort of 6 to 8 months of effect. That doesn't seem very logical. And also, if you buy a service through a very threat agnostic, through a threat specific lens, you're getting a much better picture of that particular threat, but you can't see the whole system. We looked a lot across the system around things like performance management in terms of, how do you check that this system is healthy, is running well? And there isn't a good model to do that yet. So it was really going into a level of detail to look at the systems and controls of doing it. We were then asked some specifics around, how do you do things around fraud, international finance, and some of those sort of things, which again we talked about and addressed. And the issue about not publishing it, I fully understand why they didn't at the time. You'll remember, and for those who weren't around at the time, we literally finished the work in February 2020, and the country went into lockdown in March. It thought any government of whatever persuasion or otherwise, they'd have gone, you know what, actually dealing with the global pandemic, slightly higher up the scale of things. So that's really, I think what you're seeing now with some of the talk around where policing could go, what you see from the past, you see commonality in these themes and reviews that continue long beyond the review and the individual.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things I remember you talking about in the review is the way I know you went to look at the Scottish model up at Gartcosh, and this idea of a sort of crime hubs, or sort of could you talk a bit about that and what value you think that brings?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was born of, for those who haven't seen it, the Scottish Crime Campus at Gartcosh is really worth a visit. And colleagues in Police Scotland and the precursor forces, I think it was particularly Strathclyde, That's a really imaginative way of doing it. It's bringing together a range of agencies and capabilities. I suspect nowadays in the new language, people would say they're fusion centres, or
Yeah,
it's a way of doing things and bringing people together in a way that allows organisational barriers to break down. We often tend to, and we all do it collectively, look at our organisations through the stovepipes, if you like, of the organisation, rather than looking sideways out. So if you imagine a future world where you had a crime campus that had not just police capabilities, you had obviously NCA and other parts of law enforcement, you had the security services, you had HMRC, you could have the private sector. I'm happy to talk about some of the thinking we thought about in that, because I think if we're going to do a game changer approach to serious and organised crime, we're going to have to think beyond the traditional boundaries of organisations. But you could have and we talked about the possibility to do things like skunk works and accelerator centers, so bring tech very close to where the actual thing is, all the way through to your ability to have prosecutors and those sort of things very close to the work, so you can actually make people work in a team in a completely different way. And why do we talk about that? So one, Scottish Police campus, but also I think some of our own collective history. I'd been around for something years ago that were the first joint emergency services control rooms. So I did one in Wiltshire and then moved to Gloucestershire, and Gloucestershire were just doing one. They were two of the public sector projects of their age, the late 90s and 2000s, that delivered by far the most business benefits of anything that had been done. I remember the audit of it saying, there were benefits here we didn't even see. And if you saw them working, the logic of bringing organisations together and just letting good people work without writing a 45-page information sharing agreement to get them to talk to each other, it just works and works really well. And there are examples of it working across the UK at the moment in serious and organised crime. Work with everyone from the border force to the security services. We were just talking about how you formalise that. And at the heart of it was this issue that the government is now looking at and wrestling with about how do you build capabilities for the future. Because it was pretty clear that there's, whatever way you cut it, there's not enough money in the system to build capabilities 43 times.
Yeah.
It's also probably not sensible to do all of them once. So how do you do a number between 1 and 43? And our view, when the more and more we looked at it, and I emphasize, we were very location agnostic is probably the politest word. If you want to tell me you want to do it twice north and south of the Humber, that's fine with me. But what you can't do is try and build this mod, because there is not the capacity or the money to do it 43 times. And it's probably not going to be close enough and reflective enough to local needs to do it once. So that's why we talked about building these crime campuses, these fusion centres, these regional hubs at a regional level. You'd have to, and part of the work we talked about, you'd have to formalise the role of the ROCU, because at the moment it has a limited formal standing. So we talked about how you could formalise the ROCU, and you get over some of these challenges of these things work while you and I, as I call it, play nicely. When we don't play nicely, they don't work.
Yeah, absolutely. And is what is part of that? So presumably, what part of it is formalising the setup of the rockets in some way, but also is that about the funding as well? Because one of the challenges they've got at the moment is it's exactly this point you make about how much money is just kind of time limited grants and all the rest of it, which is really kind of a very fragile basis for setting up capabilities, isn't it?
Well, and also, and you'll have seen it. I mean, the commissioner's spoken recently about it. My own experience in the Met, my experience post leaving as members of police authority. This issue of annual funding cycles, and then telling an organisation to be long-term and strategic and move to digital, and the two just don't fit together. You can try. The reality is, organisations, when you've got these sort of annual funding cycles, are often struggling just to get through to the next year to fulfil the grant requirements or something else to access the funding. To try and land it with people, I described the role of, particularly for the NCA at the time, they almost felt like they were having to behave a bit like a sort of a charity does in local government, where they come and see you, tell you the problem, and then say, when you leave, can you give us some money on the way out? You shouldn't be doing that with core capabilities for the UK. And I think particularly given what we've seen sort of post that review, with the move of, and I would argue, SOC much more in the space around, starting to move into the space around hostile state actors, the threats from other countries. We've got to see this much more as part of the security infrastructure we need for a good, safe society and sort of societal tranquility. And I think colleagues in the military and elsewhere are saying, yeah, there is something in that. And I'd use the experience from one of the first things I did after retirement. I was asked to do some work with the UK government. We're looking at serious and organised crime in Mexico. And you look at the history of Mexico, beautiful, amazing country with some really high potential people. But at times, parts of the country have been almost destabilized by serious and organised crime. You don't want to go there. And once you've gone there, as we see with other countries in South America, it's very hard to come back from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, one thing I was thinking about was the relationship. You talked about the way in which SOC needs to play a role in this kind of wider security agenda. I mean, because one of the things that, as part of some of these discussions about the way in which police reform is going, there's a conversation about, well, is it time to bring CT and SOC sort of together, or to have much greater integration between those two worlds? I mean, I just wondered what you think about this. I mean, obviously in things like terrorist finance, there's an obvious link there between people laundering money and it ending up funding terrorist organizations and so on. I mean, is that the kind of thing we need to be exploring, which is breaking down some of these, we've built sort of different capabilities in different places, and we need to sort of get them to be much better connected.
We do, and not a but, and we have to recognise that in doing that, you've still got too fewer capabilities for the size of the task.
Yeah.
Because the slight worry, so a lot of people when we were doing the review said, CT has got to be the sort of, the comparator model. Yeah. And you have to then take people through back through the work that was done in CT to build those capabilities. It's had dedicated funding streams. It's had the ability to draw from people being trained, if you like, if they're separate organizations and they're not, in core policing. So CT has done very well out of that arrangement. If you spread it too thinly, you've got to be careful. But no, the principle of what you've done is absolutely right. So there are capabilities, high-end digital, the ability to gather data. And increasingly, the threat picture means that at times you could be working in the serious and organised crime world and stumble into the role of a hostile state actor. Why would you not use CT, security services assets, and prompt the thinking? If you're doing that, why would we not use military if they get offensive cyber capability? Is there a role for that in there? I think this whole space is opening a set of different questions and potentially new and different solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And just sort of moving into some of these debates which we're currently having about police reform, and I'm I can't pretend to be neutral on this because I'm one of the people who's been an advocate for some of this stuff. But I mean, one of the things which obviously the Home Secretary announced last week was this idea of what she calls a national policing centre, which is, and we have yet to see what will be in that, but it's pretty clear that it's an attempt to consolidate quite a bit of stuff at the centre, which is currently quite fragmented in different organisations, whether it's operational support capabilities and various enabling capabilities, technology and other things as well. And I think but I think there's going to be a wider debate. So we've got this white paper which is coming along, and it feels to me as part of that there is going to be this wider debate about, is there stuff that's currently done locally that ought to be done regionally? Is there stuff that's done locally or regionally that ought to be done nationally? I just wondered what your sort of broad reflections are on that as a direction of travel, and whether you had any thoughts about the kind of potential solutions that seem to be knocking around.
Yeah, so I was asked to describe, not to miss, but often when we're talking to groups of people doing both the SOC review and other reviews, where did I think the sort of the future end game would end up? And if you describe it as a continual model, I saw the growth being at the region.
Right. Yeah.
So a
Yeah.
much more a center of a controlling mind. And I've probably, through the latter part of my service and post-retirement, I've tried to see the world as others would see it. You know, if you were Rick, we'll make you Home Secretary tomorrow. You're going to run a complex, quite fragmented system that you've got very little vision over. And I don't mean vision in terms of the long-term vision over what's going on, what's
Yeah.
happening, the health of it. I think you need a centre that has much more of a controlling mind type role, that's got
Yeah.
data, that's very data rich, that's using high levels of intelligence. And then you try and move as much of the delivery, I would suggest, to a region. As I say,
Yeah.
I know we've got people around the country who well, I don't like the region I'm in.
Yeah.
Let's not fight that bait yet. Let's push it to that sort of level, so that you end up with, your local officer, be it in Wiltshire, Cumbria, the Met, wherever it may be, who effectively feels like there is this level of support behind them and focus, so that when they do come into this isn't just a small community problem that they're empowered to resolve. This is a serious and organised crime issue. They've got some potential to get asset and resource to assist them. And I think the sector is going to have to do some of that consolidation to find the money to
Yeah.
fund some of the things it wants to do. And the reality is, when you look at policing with 43 potential back offices, all those well-rehearsed things, that's probably some of the space we've got to go looking for efficiencies and value for money, because it's increasingly difficult to see where else you go, given that, and it's quite a good time to look at this, we've had change of government. The last two governments, if you like, over the last two budget cycles, have seen and heard what policing thinks it needs in terms of doing it. That sum of money isn't there.
Yeah.
So, there's a danger we'll be being, what's the phrase I used to use? It will be right, but not influential.
Yes. Yeah.
The
Yeah.
reality is, if we're not getting through on these sorts of issues, and people are not saying we get it, policing PLC, or you need an extra £3 billion, then we need to go back and think, what are we not landing?
Yeah, absolutely. And what about, I mean, do you have views on the sort of governance around all of this? Because one of the things that comes up is, I mean, again, I'm not a neutral arbiter on this, because my view is that basically we currently have a system which makes it very difficult to make decisions collectively, because people ultimately don't have to play ball if they don't, particularly if it comes down to money and people pooling resource. Then ultimately they're local chiefs and PCCs are the kind of fixed points in the system, and they have the authority to do what they want with the money they've got. But it's do you think something needs to be done there in terms of how decisions are made nationally or indeed regionally, and is that and that's obviously always been a difficulty in progressing this agenda, because you're asking people to maybe give up a bit of power, or at least give up the it's that thing where you're sort of saying, I can give you a better capability, but basically you have to give up the ability to control it yourself. And that's where the grit is in this discussion, isn't it?
It is, but that's why I think you've got to do it as you can't. So it's reflecting, there are probably two or three areas for me that I've sort of looked at over the years that you think, this is quite a complex problem, and one of the challenges in it is we oversimplify it. So we say sort of funding, service, and accountability, and well, we know what the services we want to provide. We'll worry about the others. No, you've actually got to do all of those, folks. If you don't address the issue around funding, and I don't mean giving people, it's not simple just as giving people more funding, but address how you do contributions. So having sat for 10 years or more in what was ACPO and then NPCC, often the debate was to reassure people. It wasn't some. I didn't sense I'm not voting for Christmas. I'm on my way out here if I vote for this. I sense much more. How can I explain that I'm going to put £500,000 in a central pot for a service I'm hardly ever going to use, as I see it on my threat picture at the moment?
Yeah.
Or conversely, I'm going to have to put money in based on the fact I've already invested a whole load of money in providing that service. So you've got to look at what I would call the rewards and incentives around funding to unlock some of that debate. Particularly when you've got the situation you've got in policing at the moment, where in some forces, you're now over 50% of funding comes from local.
Yeah.
You can see a politician of whatever political persuasion saying, well, thank you very much, Home Secretary Muir. I'm not doing that. I put 50% of the funding in and I say this. So I think you've got to address them as a totality, but then you have got to do that accountability thing. And I've seen some of the ideas and thinking about qualified majority voting and those sorts of things. There are absolutely ways of doing it that allow that to move forward. But I do think we have to keep going back to this system was never built to do these sorts of things.
Yeah.
We purposely, collectively, UK PLC designed a policing system that pours money into 43 areas. None of the performance framework incentivise you to work in partnership, working with your neighbour or join coalitions. It doesn't do that. We've never intervened in or put someone on the sort of proverbial naughty step because they didn't play nicely in the region. So everything is about delivery at the local. So that's why I say you have to understand the system and change the whole system to have effect. But you're right, if you do it at the pace we currently are able to do it, and good chiefs will just disappear because they've they're at their 6th time at Chiefs Council and they said, I can't do this again, try and persuade another 4th. So no, you've got to move much quicker on it in terms of doing it, but you've got to do it in a way that hopefully brings as many people as you can with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to say to people listening in, if you do have any questions or comments you want to put in on anything we've said, or indeed anything else you think it would be interesting to discuss, then just please put those in the chat function as we go along, and I'll come to them as we do. So I just wanted to talk a bit about fraud, because I know you've done quite a bit of work on fraud, and this is obviously one of those where it's a huge, I mean, in terms of volumes, it's massive, and it's it's a huge thing. It's very varied because it's some of it looks fairly trivial, and some of it is people destroys people's lives, and it's really, really impactful. So and part of the problem I think with it is because we just have this one thing called fraud. It's like people don't. There's so many things happening within that it's quite hard to kind of communicate it. But I think what were your thoughts on the system? So you had a look at action fraud, and I know they're renaming action fraud, and there's lots of reforms that the City of London Police having trained there now, and we've got this new national fraud strategy and so on. So there is a lot of change going on. But what was your sense of what the problem is? Now, I guess looking at it, from the public's point of view, I guess the problem is you report fraud and basically not very much happens, and then trying to get a solution, or trying to get your money back is a complete nightmare, right? So from the public's point of view, it feels like a system which isn't really working. But it's obviously from the police's point of view a fiendishly complex set of challenges. So what was your take on where this system is at and where it needs to go?
So a few things. And just to declare an interest, I'm now an independent member of the City of London Board, watching those changes. And just a bit of a push for people. Some of the tech changes and some of the changes that will come in that space are really, really exciting. So I do think there's the real hope. So people will remember there was a very good piece of investigative journalism done by the Times team that exposed some behaviour in the action fraud call centre, as it was at the time, by any call centre standards was wrong, was all those sorts of things. So there was a very specific piece about that.
Yeah.
But in fairness to the corporation, what they said is, can you look at the wider system and why this satisfaction? So with colleague, I looked at both action fraud, National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, and then the system. And it would be a misnomer to say it's a system. You will have followed the debates sort of during the early 2000s and mid 2000s, where people talked about the volumes of fraud going up and 40% by most of where we are at the moment. I think your outline in the question is absolutely right. This is a huge bucket of offences. I've spent quite a lot of time around this, but even I glaze over when people want to argue, is it cyber enabled? Is it not cyber enabled? Is it, and you sort of go, oh gosh, look, let's take a much more customer public focused view. This is a fraud. I know why we have to have all the categories so we understand what's going on underneath it, but no, it does need that. It is an area as well where we've got to talk much more about things that may not be judicial outcomes, because I think we're getting into a space with the volumes where judicial outcomes, and it's not about policing saying we can't do this, it's all too difficult. Actually, judicial outcomes may not be the answer on it. So I think, and something I've always worked with in my service, having run a sort of control rooms many years ago, and sitting with a very bright colleague who came up with this sort of, look, you've got to understand policing in a sort of a 4-box model. And I sort of went, what's all this then? How's this work? He said, you've got to understand it. Everything, whether it's a murder or a road traffic accident, has a first contact with the organisation.
Yeah.
It has some form of initial response.
Yeah.
It has a secondary response, and it has a closure. And if you're really lucky, he said, you have a feedback loop. Now, sometimes that takes place all within the call.
Yeah.
So what we've all tended to focus on is that initial, that sort of first contact with police. And that's what action fraud as it currently is and configured, that's what it's all about. To reassure people, as part of that work and as part of the SOC review, we were asked to also look, does anyone else in the world do this better? It might surprise people, but most people said, we would like something like that where we take it in one place. What you call it, action fraud Australia or whatever you want to call it, brand it, that's an issue. But it is interesting that most people could see the logic, particularly as tech has gone and the ability to do things with data. So it brings me on to why the tech is important. When we did the review of action fraud, and particularly NFIB part of it, the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau, to find people having to use sort of Excel spreadsheets to do sort of, and then running out of lines because there were more lines in the intelligence than there were on the spreadsheet, you sort of go, oh my gosh, this is. So the new system, the ability to put machine learning in, the ability that literally as I type a number in, it's making links behind the scenes, that's what we'd all expect and hope policing can do. There is then a whole thing about how do you systemize what goes on behind that, the system, because at the moment it sort of goes out of the City of London, out of action fraud, out of NFIB, and goes into forces who are already sort of almost like, gosh, not more, please. And when you look at what you'd have to do and how long it would take if you were going to try and grow these resources in terms of policing, you have to say it's probably not achievable. Which is not a pleasant thing to do, to say. When we did the SOC review, the system was about 4,000 or 5,000 detectives short from memory at that point. I suspect it's got worse since then. And by the system, I mean the SOC system as a whole. So we started to think about how could you do this completely differently. And I do think this is an area where there's going to have to be a much more blended public-private piece of work. I found a few examples, including Police Service in Northern Ireland, where people were working with private sector companies, particularly like the Big Four and some of those, to buy in specialist resource and capability that they just hadn't got in the number and volumes they need. And it does leave you thinking, with all the people now who are trained in money laundering and those sorts of things in the various walks of life, people at the bar who are doing private prosecutions for fraud, and that's quite a growing business. Why is there not much more of a public-private partnership on how we do that to leverage the sort of response we're going to need? We then need to do a bit more around, and part of the thing we looked at in the SOC review is what I would call a sort of a polluter pays type thing, and whether people should have, an organisation should have a duty to prevent and a duty to report. So how would we see that working? And people will have their own views. You know, there are people who I know don't like more government regulation, but it struck me as strange that I could develop an app this afternoon. I could put it on the market with very little security stuff that exposes, let's pick a crime type, exposes young people to child pornography, and the sector picks up the fallout of that. I don't. Now, I can't tell you must do this, but I am saying, actually, governments, you need to think about this. Where do you want the balance to be in terms of those sorts of things?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I'm really interested in your thought on this issue of the private sector and the police working together, because I mean, one of the things is, I mean, as you were saying, you know, one of the challenges in policing is getting access to a lot of the skills that are now in the private sector. You know, things like the data science people, the you know, the data analysts, you know, the tech people, you know, all this stuff, which is challenging. How do you think that could? Because I've heard you say that, you know, having partnerships that can allow the private sector to support, you know, specific investigations, for example, and brings tools in. I mean, how can you just describe how you think that could work in practice?
So there are a number of ways to do it. At a very simple level, we talked about it when we were doing the SOC review. We said, you know, you could imagine each of the regional crime campuses having a sum of money to buy a service in. You've got to be really clear what you're buying. You know, you can see a world where financial investigators can have a career pathway. That at one point they're a police officer, the next point they're working for a big city corporation, and maybe 10 years later they come back to you as a police officer. I think we're going to have to think about a whole, it's clear we're all going to have to think about how we do this fundamentally different. Because, and that's not a, some people go, oh no, you know, it's got to be in policing, public would never accept this. I think the public are far more accepting and understanding of that than we sometimes give them credit for. I think it goes to your opening bit. I want my money back. I want to know it's not going to happen again. And I want to know whoever did it might get caught or something might protect them. And I think if you look at this week, where we've had a lot of work this week about, you know, the scams week on national media, I think the reality is we'll get much, much better at getting upstream intelligence of what's happening quite quickly in this space. It's how we then get it out to people in a way they can use it that's going to be the real skill.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's, I mean, some really interesting stuff there, and of course it's worth reflecting on the fact that the there are models out there, like with the insurance industry paying for policing, don't they, through the because there are some areas where and we're actually about to start some work on this, some areas of particularly acquisitive crime where basically the police cannot prioritize certain things because they're too niche, they're not big, they don't score big enough on the sort of harm register. But they're nonetheless crime, like, so insurance fraud's a good example, or agricultural equipment theft, or, you know, all of these sorts of things that, you know, they're where actually I think it seems that the private sector actually is willing to put in some resource into those things because they can see the benefit. So it's a question of being a bit more imaginative about all of this, isn't it?
It is, and I think there are people there. I mean, what I remember well, I spent a fascinating afternoon with a colleague from the bar who does private fraud prosecutions.
Right.
And you sort of go, wow. And him talking about how they've grown, how sometimes, it will not meet anyone's threshold at the SFO, NCA,
Yeah.
a particular police force, but actually it's a big fraud involving someone's pension fund, let's say.
Yeah.
Absolutely right that you go after it and try and get the money,
Yeah.
and try and secure recovery. But that creates a whole level of skills that sit outside the public sector that I think we've got to be more imaginative about how we welcome in, rather than the sort of, well, if I haven't got 20 people in the office with me, it won't work. I
Yeah.
think also in policing, certainly the people I talk to now are much more imaginative, clever, bright, and willing to think differently than I was at that point in service. So there's some real hope on that one.
And look, one thing I wanted to ask you about, Craig, was you were deputy commissioner at the Met during the whole period of austerity, when there was a lot of obviously financial pressure. I mean, there still is a lot of financial
Yeah.
pressure on the Met, as we've heard from Mark Rowley and others. I mean, I just wondered if there are any lessons that you think we should draw out of that period. So policing went through this period of significant reductions in funding, had to make lots of various changes. I mean, we're still in a world of financial scarcity, and and even with the government in the budget releasing a bit more money and trying to at least say that austerity is over, at the same time we know that things are still going to be pretty tight. So I was just wondering on your reflections on that period of austerity and what it is that are there sort of lessons for now that we can take out of things that were done then?
Yeah, so I'm absolutely sure there are. It's so first of all, I think it's the public, and often sometimes even the politicians, don't understand the size of the challenge that they ask in terms of doing it. Why would they? Very few people understand how a pound of money is spent on policing. When you sort of go, well, 80p of it is entirely people. So if you want to cut deep, it's people.
Yeah.
Now, you can either change the mix of people, you can look at whether you do the service yourself or buy it in, but it's almost certainly going to be people. And if you cut into that sort of 20p, don't be surprised you haven't got a cutting edge digital organization, that you've got something that's slightly back from that. So you first of all understand the money. And this was really interesting going into austerity. I mean, austerity came slightly late for the Met compared to a number of the other forces because, of course, of the Olympics. But working with brilliant people like Dr. Nina Cope, who's now at the MOD, absolutely amazing and capable individual, we tried to find a way to make the challenge real. So the Met had to save £535 million when the Olympic Flames went out. So
Right.
used it in that way, 535 million. And you get a public debate that's about, at one end, it's sort of, take away the nice car the commissioner has and you've saved all the money sort of
Right.
approach,
Yeah.
and tea and biscuits, and you've done it all through to sort of turn the lights off when you leave. But 535 million at that time was a force the size of Greater Manchester.
Right. Yeah. Well.
So you sort of say to people, that's the challenge.
Yeah.
So we can either spend the next 4 or 5 years feeling sorry for ourselves and sort of woe is me, because there'd be every justification for that, or you can sort of say, right, how could we do this differently? Now, it's
Yeah.
not perfect, don't get me wrong. I'm not the person who's going to say everything we did was brilliant and that's where it goes. But it's absolutely key. You have to first start with an understanding of the scale of the problem. And someone said to me the other day something I absolutely reflect on. Thought, yeah, you've also got to be clear, what services in policing do you want to deliver? And what could you do completely differently with a partner, with a local authority? Go on, how could we do this differently? So I think it opens up an art of the possible in terms of the financial constraints around it. It also, and if I was still in police, I was saying, I want multi-year settlements. All right, they might be tough, but I need multi-year settlements, because sitting on the police authorities now, I see I see some of the frustration of independent members where I say, well, why can't they do something more imaginative? You sort of say, because they know they've got to do this same process again in 8 months' time to get the money
Yeah,
again next year.
yeah,
You
yeah,
can't do much very imaginative when you get your budget approved on the 31st of March, and by September you've got to redo your entire budget.
yeah,
So
yeah,
they are. So I think you've got to say, well, all right, let's have some multi-year settlements and let's see where we go from there. So I think there are some bits that we can absolutely take away and learn from last time. It's also one where I would say as well, value the quality of good police staff.
right,
When
yeah,
I finished in the Met, they gave me a wonderful opportunity with management board to go and say, go on, and what's your learning? What have you picked up over 7 years of doing this? What should we watch for, etc., etc. And I remember saying something at the time. People thought, oh, I was more worried about losing some key senior members of police staff with real skills than I was
mm,
about losing people like me.
yeah,
I'm imminently replaceable if I go under the bus tomorrow, sort of thing. We have a policing system that hopefully brings through people, and they're usually
mm,
better and capable than I ever was. I'm worried if you lose if you lose your data people, if you lose
yeah,
your heads of HR, these people are particularly in the current market, are in very, very short supply. And there's some extremely good people around policing that we ought to collectively grab hold of. So you're going to need those good people going forward. You also need an understanding of the capacity of your organisation to do change. So there are 2 or 3 things for me that I touched on the sort of, I worry about people who offer you simple solutions to complex problems. I worry about people who are blasé about delivery.
right,
We have a problem. It's not just a policing problem. It's a public sector. It's a UK government type problem of all shades and perfection, that people don't engage in the detail of delivery, and
yeah,
there's only so much capacity to do it. It was put to me best during the austerity program by an external consultant who not worked in the sector before and came in and said, you're trying to do live change on a system that's actually running 24/7 and is mission critical to the people of London. I said,
yeah,
yes, that's how it
yeah,
works. He says, it feels like you're asking me to, I always remember, he said, it feels like you're asking me to change the wheel on an A380 on final
right,
approaches to Heathrow. I said, well, it's not quite as difficult as that, hopefully, but it gives you an idea of, I think there's a lack of understanding sometimes that the organisation, whoever they are, however great they are, only have so much capacity to cope with and manage change.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, really helpful, great. And we've got a question from Mike Levy, who has done a lot of work on fraud over the years. He says, how might the public-private model work when large corporations like banks have done the offending? So, I mean, I guess there's a question there about um, you clearly wouldn't want
No,
people.
so I think I do think that's manageable. So one of the other things we talked about in the SOC review would help in that space. So I spoke a little bit around the duty to prevent and the duty to report. We also suggested that you should give your controlling mind, in this case the NCA, the power to instruct regulators to go into sectors. So I'll make it up. Craig Mackey Banking PLC continually fails to meet the standard, the NCA ought to be able to instruct the banking regulator to say there have been too many failures, you're under an enhanced level of supervision. So there are ways of making the system work.
Yeah, absolutely. And just, I mean, just to uh, sort of bring it back to, I mean, bring it back to the Met in a way. I mean, um, the big challenges we've got is obviously this issue around public confidence, public trust and confidence in policing at the moment, and obviously a lot of that has come out of events in the Met, and everyone on this call will be familiar with. Um, uh, what what do you think is the answer there? I mean, Mark Rowley's obviously doing a lot on that. They're obviously trying to deal with misconduct issues, and they've got a new central unit that's trying to look out for people who uh, officers who have lots of complaints against them, although there's seem to have a lot of risk around them and so on. there's stuff on the conduct space they're doing. They're trying to put themselves back in the neighbourhood policing space in a heavier way. I mean, what's your sort of sense of what are the building blocks here in terms of winning back public trust and confidence in the police?
So I think the work they're doing around standards and behaviour, absolutely a key part of it. But I think, as you implied in your question, that in itself is not enough. The reality is, and I think it's interesting when you look at other public services. So if you ask at the moment to a number of people, there's no confidence in any public service. You get this sort of, I don't like the term, but you get this narrative of broken Britain. You can be standing in a supermarket, and it usually starts with a conversation about a pothole, and then someone proceeds to tell you that nothing works in the country. Well, it's clearly not true. And policing in particular does do amazing things on a daily basis. So absolutely do the stuff about behaviour and standards. I don't think that's a panacea in itself. I think people get their confidence and their about the basic levels of service you offer. So the work the team are doing in the Met, and they're doing in other forces, about getting, I don't like the phrase getting the basics right, because it implies they're not at the moment, but making sure there is a more consistent approach to basic policing service, I think will pay dividends in the medium to long term. But I don't think we can sort of dislocate this issue from these wider issues people feel about their public services. A little thing I once did in a public meeting was a real eye opener to me, when I got this sort of, I said, well, who do you get a service off that you enjoy getting a service off and you like? Yeah. And the room went quiet. So do you like any of your? No, don't like any of our banks. We don't like any of our utilities. Now you sort of go, oh gosh, have we got to that? So I think we've got to do some of those sorts of things. The other thing I think policing needs to do, my reflection when policing was at its least responsive, is when it looked in on itself. So I would say to anyone involved in oversight or looking at policing, don't make policing hunker down and look in on itself. It becomes quite an unhelpful organisation when you do that. It's got a very hard shell. That's the nature of the role we ask police officers to do. So don't just hit it and tell it it's bad.
Yeah. No, very well put, Craig. And look, we've run out of time, but we could have talked all afternoon, I suspect, about these issues. No, but that was a tour de force. Thank you, Craig, because that was a really good just sort of discussion over a lot of really important themes that are going to be that are very live and being discussed at the moment. So thank you so much for your time. We've
thank you, and
really enjoyed
it.
For
the people who've borne with us, Rick, while we've gone through this.
Yeah, I know. And thank you to those who've put in questions, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And we'll be doing another of these next month. I'm just going to see if I can find when it is. If we've got one in December, we do them every month. So let me see if I can dig it out. Yes, what's my one in December? I think it's with Karen Wilson, isn't it? So yeah, sorry, my computer's been really slow. So yes, it is with Karen Wilson on the 13th of December. Nicole has kindly put that in. So we'll be at 1 o'clock, 13th of December, with Karen Wilson talking about her career in policing. Karen was latterly assistant chief constable at Lincolnshire Police, and we'll be talking to her about her experience as a senior woman in policing, senior woman of colour, and many of the similar sort of themes we discussed today with Craig. We'll be talking to Karen about. So do join us for that, and indeed we will be having sessions every month over 2025, such as these, and we'll be advertising those in the years ahead, so in the weeks ahead. So do watch out for that on our social media channels. But thank you all for joining us. Thanks very much, Craig, for your time, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Thank you. Bye now.